Welcome everyone. My name's Gil. For those who haven't met me, as Aggie said, I'm the Commercial and Natural Capital Director here at Restore, and I suspect by virtue of your attendance that most of you know who and what Restore is, but I'll give you a quick rundown just in case. So Restore is a nature restoration business, and we really focus on the practical delivery of highly ambitious nature recovery. Ultimately, we're a business of ecologists and naturalists, and for us, nature always comes first. That's our kind of core North Star. Now, all of our projects produce natural capital or ecosystem services of some kind that businesses can purchase or participate in. But I guess the key differentiator for us as an organization is that for us, nature is always the objective, and these are the means to achieve that objective. Anyway, that's who we are. That's what we are. For those of you who don't know, we're joined today by Jenny and Tom. Hello, both. And they're part of the team at Nature Positive. Now, we at Restore work closely with Nature Positive, so I won't do their intros for them, but whilst they use their deep expertise to help businesses understand their impacts and dependencies on nature and the risks and opportunities therein, we work together so that we're able to provide opportunity for practical restoration action, participation and leadership for nature for businesses. So it's quite a powerful partnership that we've been enjoying over the last few months. So look, I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to hand over now to Jenny and Tom, who will properly introduce themselves, and they will give us a brief presentation before we kick off our Q&A. Over to you both. Can't wait to hear what you've got to say.
Great. Thanks, Gil. So yeah, my name's Jenny Hughes. I'm an Associate Director at Nature Positive. And as it sort of said on the other slide there, making sustainability second nature for all the organisations we work with is our mission. So we work with organisations including businesses, financial institutions, local authorities, other charitable organisations, and nature and biodiversity. Biodiversity is one of the really important topics. But yeah, I'll let Tom give a bit more on that.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Gil. So I'm Tom Mason. I'm an Associate Director at Nature Positive, leading up our work as Jenny and Gil described, with corporates and also with financial institutions on understanding their nature-related risks, their opportunities for integrating nature into their strategies, and developing their targets, whether it's science-based targets or otherwise. There was a really interesting quote I heard the other day that is, nature is business's most critical supplier. Which is really quite true when you start looking at the extent of a lot of supply chains of the companies we work with. But we're still seeing that for most, I think it's fair to say most boards, most companies haven't really registered nature fully as a strategic issue. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And we've only got 4 slides, so don't worry, we'll get into the Q&A in the breakout rooms in a timely manner. But we're going to give you an overview of the regulatory and the market drivers which are starting to place nature-related risks and opportunities as a strategic consideration for businesses, and also talk about how companies are most commonly and most effectively doing this. So just to touch on the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TNFD, which some of you might know about. This was released in draft form in 2021, and it's been evolving ever since. And it's a framework, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. It's a framework that enables companies to understand where and how they impact or rely on nature, and to set formal targets or make public disclosures or help them in developing their strategy. As of today, I think there are just over 700 companies now. It was 600 last year, 700 this year, which have committed publicly to using the TNFD framework to evaluate their nature-related risks and opportunities, to develop their strategies, to create action plans, which integrates nature as a strategic topic alongside climate and human rights risks. And in some cases, for them to make public disclosures and actually set specific science-based targets to address the extent of these impacts or their dependencies on natural resources, ecosystems, and biodiversity. I'm going to pass over to Jenny to talk a little bit more about what that landscape looks like.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Aggie, if you just move to the next slide. So Why is this issue really important now? So Tom mentioned a really important milestone, the TNFD. But I think the headline from this slide and from what I'm going to talk about, I actually think it's really positive. Things are really moving very, very quickly, and the urgency for acting on nature and biodiversity is building fast. So let's start on the left-hand side of the slide with some of the most recent evidence from this year. And this is the kind of material that you could potentially use to help make the internal case for nature right now. So the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, published early in the year, is unambiguous. In the long term, environmental risks dominate the global risk horizon. And the UK's National Security Assessment, also published earlier this year, went even further. It identified every critical ecosystem as being on a path to irreversible collapse. And finally, the Financial Conduct Authority is currently got a live consultation on the UK sustainability reporting standards. And essentially, for me, what that means is that ISSB aligned disclosure is coming soon for listed companies. And to make that a bit more straightforward in what I mean, the key implication for businesses is that they're required to report on financially material topics. And from our perspective, nature is a financial material topic for many businesses. So the science is quite stark, the policy signal is clear, but I think the really important thing to highlight is this isn't new context just from this year in these publications. What we're seeing is the culmination of several years of momentum. So I just wanted to kind of highlight and give a whistle-stop tour of that, of the key milestones that really brought us here. So back in 2022, the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. This is essentially kind of nature's Paris Agreement moment. 196 countries committed to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. And this includes the landmark 30 by 30 goal. And that's really the kind of global North Star, and Gil used that word as well. It's the North Star for nature that's driven everything since. Tom mentioned the TNFD recommendations, which were finalised in 2023. By 2024, CDP, an important kind of questionnaire for companies that integrated biodiversity alongside other environmental topics, including plastics, water, forests. And also in 2024, we saw the first cohort of companies achieve validated science-based targets for nature. And that's the nature equivalent of the SBTI. Kering Group, Holcim, GlaxoSmithKline were among the first kind of target setters there. In Europe, CSRD this year, after a lot of discussion last year, is now finalised. The Omnibus package was formally adopted in February. We've mentioned the UK SRS as well, and what we see on the horizon is the International Sustainability Standards Board is actively developing nature disclosure requirements, and they'll be captured in a standard called IFRS S3, and that's going to be focused on nature, and we're expecting to see a draft publication at this year's Biodiversity COP in October. So there's a lot of acronyms on this slide, but I think the key thing to emphasize is the clear direction of travel. Regulations, methods and guidance is really harmonizing on business action to contribute to a nature positive future. Next slide, please, Aggie. So that's the context. It's quite complicated, but how do you actually make the business case for acting on nature and biodiversity with your land, with your leadership teams and with your board? And from my perspective, there's 4 levels or drivers that are really important to use. And each business is going to be unique in their culture and their strategy and operations. So it will vary which of these drivers is going to be most important to pull on when you're making the case to your leadership teams. But firstly, risk and resilience is a really important place to start. I think resilience is probably one of the most often used words I hear these days. But for nature, it is really important. Nature underpins supply chains, soils, water, climate stability. And water risk is particularly going up the agenda for UK businesses. Flooding, water stress, pollution, water quality, these are issues where there's growing awareness of these, and they're increasingly important to resilient operations. I just want to highlight also that there's been an important legal opinion published by Pollination, and this highlights that directors have a legal duty under sections 172 and 174 of the Companies Act to identify and manage nature-related risks. So this isn't just a sustainability team issue, this is a governance issue. We've talked about regulatory momentum, so here I just want to make a really practical point. The businesses that fare best on compliance aren't the ones who scramble when the deadline lands and when the regulation applies to them. They're the ones who start early. A phased approach is going to give you time to build the quality evidence, embed the right processes, and avoid the costs and reputational risk of really reactive last minute preparations. And if you're not a big company that's listed, it doesn't mean it's not relevant. Procurement requirements are tightening, and being ahead of the regulations strengthens your position considerably with your supply chain and with your partners. The third lever is the investment opportunity. Nature is not just a risk, it's an emerging asset class, and the capital really is starting to flow. There is a huge investment gap still, but we're seeing some really important signals. So for example, investment in nature-based solutions for water security alone doubled over the last decade, reaching 49 billion in 2023. So yeah, there's still a significant funding gap, but businesses that can demonstrate credible action are going to be better placed to access capital. Finally, peer pressure and leadership positioning is really important. The reality is that leading businesses aren't waiting. Major companies and financial institutions are already acting, and we'll probably come on to some examples of those. What we're finding from conversations we're having is that nature literacy in the boardroom is a competitive differentiator. And essentially, it's critical if you're seriously going to integrate nature into your business strategy, that your board is up to speed and aware of nature issues. And for many leadership teams, peer positioning is one of the most powerful levers, whether that's keeping pace with competitors or meeting the expectations of companies you supply. So I'll pass on to Tom, who's just going to talk through this practical framework.
Yeah, so I think you've seen all the acronyms that there possibly might be in the nature space now. So here's a couple more. The TNFD LEAP framework. So this is becoming very widespread. A lot of companies, I mentioned it at the start, there's 700 or so organizations who have committed to conducting their TNFD assessments and following the LEAP framework. It stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. But what's very handy about this framework is that it is by design meant to support or interlink with all of those other reporting standards and frameworks. So for big businesses in Europe, if you're conducting your nature assessment, nature materiality assessment for the CSRD reporting disclosures, if you're amongst the biggest firms, you can use the TNFD framework for that. If you're setting science-based targets for nature, the TNFD framework and the science-based targets framework are pretty much the same. So whenever we do a TNFD assessment for a company at the same time, we're also doing the first steps of the science-based targets assessment. And it's also very closely aligned to the Global Reporting Initiative, so the GRI reporting, if any of your businesses report against that. And recently, there was a creation of a new ISO standard, and this is for the integration of biodiversity into organizational strategy. So it's ISO standard 17298, very catchy. But despite there being so many frameworks and acronyms, they all lend to each other very, very well. So the TNFD locate phase, this is for many organizations, it's quite an easy win, to actually get started on nature. You don't have to do the whole TNFD framework in one go. It's modular, you can do bits and pieces. The whole idea is that you iterate over time, you understand what you can do, you understand where your gaps are, and you take it piece by piece. So the locate phase is an easy win. All you need to do is identify where your physical locations, either your operations or your supply chain, typically the tier 1 suppliers, if you're sourcing wood, quite often to the source of origin, where these operations or supply chains intersect with sensitive locations. So a sensitive location has a specific definition under TNFD. It's a site which is highly water stressed, which has high biodiversity importance, which has high biodiversity integrity or rapidly degrading ecosystem integrity, or which contains important natural resources for communities. So if a site intersects with any of those sites, it's sensitive and needs to be prioritized for a deeper dive assessment. There are loads of public and open source tools that you can use to do this. And the important part of the locate phase is identifying not just locations, but also specific business activities which might be creating adverse impacts or have a high degree of reliance on resources or natural systems. So that's the first phase of TNFD. Second step, evaluate, and this is where you're typically bringing in primary data to really understand whether issues are material or not and identify data gaps. So you might be conducting or looking at life cycle assessment analysis. You could conduct a biodiversity footprint which is a type of life cycle assessment. Or you might be looking at your waste data or your water data. If you have it, you'd look at your pollution data, for example, point source pollution from a factory, and you'd identify where you actually have negative impacts on the environment and to what extent or how severe they are. And then the assess phase of the TNFD LEAP process, it's about identifying specific risks and opportunities and integrating them into your company risk register, your ERM, and your action plan. And this is a really great stage or point in the assessment for engaging stakeholders. Quite often the TNFD assessments are led by ESG teams, sustainability teams. Usually at this point, we will quite often run a scenario analysis or a workshop, and we'll bring in different parts of the business. You bring in not just sustainability team, you bring in your finance team, you bring in your risk team, you bring in your product team, procurement, operations, supply chain, and you get everybody talking about those potential nature-related risks. And it also helps to socialize the topic within the business, because for many companies, nature and biodiversity and ecosystems are a completely new topic. So when you start talking to internal stakeholders about these risks and opportunities in the context of what they do, it's a really powerful way to actually get things moving. And then the final phase, the prepare phase, this is where you're typically using all that evidence that you've collected in the rest of the process, the stakeholder input that you've acquired, to set some reasonable targets or to make some public disclosures. So that TNFD LEAP approach cuts across many different reporting standards. By doing the TNFD LEAP assessment, you can also make meaningful progress to the new ISO standard alignment. So you can see on the slide, it just sort of outlines where they are connected and what kind of actions meet both criteria. And importantly, the TNFD LEAP process is designed to fit into integrated reporting. So you're also going to be looking at climate, you're also going to be looking at human rights. That's embedded into the methodology. So you can potentially look at all three of those key ESG topics in one go. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Gil, because I think we've got some Q&A.
Thank you both very much for a really great platform from which to base our understanding of the current status and this next phase of a bit of Q&A as we delve a bit deeper. One of the things I'd quite like to do, I'm going to play the role of an ill-informed person. I'm going to play it, I think, really naturally. It's going to come really easily to me. I'd like, if you could, to give me a sense of what this really looks like in practice on the ground. So what does put me in a room that you're in and you're taking a leading business through this process. What does that look like? And I've got two tracks to this. So much of what we talk about is about risk and it's about compliance. And you can see that regulatory momentum building through TNFD all the way to IFRS S3, really good. But is there another strand, I'm hoping there is, where organizations are seeing the opportunity every bit as loudly, as clearly as they are seeing the risk and exposure? So what does it look like on the ground for you guys?
You can start, Tom.
Yeah, of course. It's really quite a mix, because there are so many businesses at different points of maturity on this. You take some of the largest organizations who are quite public with their discussions on nature and biodiversity, and you see that they're already making investments into nature-based solutions. They have large-scale partnerships and so on. But what I find really interesting is those sort of small, medium-sized enterprises who are really only looking at this for the first time. And typically you'll go into this kind of engagement or a TNFD LEAP assessment with a business, and it is very risk focused, because really that's what they need to build the business case. But what we're seeing more and more of is that those risks themselves are helping businesses to identify specific opportunities, and those opportunities are, sometimes it's technical solutions, sometimes it comes down to reducing your water usage, and there you might need to make technical investments, but it's also helping them to identify where they can engage with external partners on landscape engagement, habitat creation, and it's just helping companies to see practically when they make investments in the environment and when they make investments in protecting nature and conserving ecosystems, it actually helps them to build up a competitive difference. It helps them to build up resilience in their supply chain. It helps them to protect against physical climate risks, and all these then have knock-on impacts. Is that it's better for their costs, they get reduced insurance premiums, they know that they have stability in supply. So, you know, we're starting to see that it is moving, I'd say, away from a really purely reporting driven approach, which a couple of years ago it was all about getting your reporting standards completed and public and disclosed. There's been a bit of a rollback on those standards, and I think that we're seeing that companies are taking a bit more initiative to engage meaningfully with let's say conservation projects or, you know, direct interventions on their sites.
Thank you. Jenny, do you want to add anything to that before I continue down my final question?
Yeah, of course. And I think I can probably give a few examples here that are a little bit more about the brand opportunity, the marketing, the storytelling, the engagement with people on the topic. So one of the examples I really like is from the Spey catchment up in Scotland, which is actually where I'm from, and I've done some work in the area as well. What I've seen there is that whiskey companies who are utterly dependent on water quality and those natural resources for their product, they're really starting to, they're investing a lot in their own technologies and improving efficiency and stuff like that, but they're also then investing back into the landscape. I wouldn't say this is yet at the scale where I think this is proportionate to how dependent they are on the landscape in this instance, but it's really clear in terms of the narrative they're saying about these projects as well. So they're investing in projects including riparian woodland planting, shading, to try and reduce the sort of effects of climate change. But they're also then supporting roles in these kind of catchment-based organisations. And they're kind of using that storytelling narrative because for whiskey, the place is so kind of significant in terms of that product, that they can see the kind of brand value in doing that. And we're seeing that kind of scale up in lots of different ways. So yeah, we sort of did a study with the Spey catchment on this topic to help them think about how they could really kind of scale up and get other companies to co-invest. And there are lots of other examples of those kind of catchment and watershed initiatives, and companies starting to invest back to improve resilience in their supply chain, but then also see these other kind of benefits and opportunities.
Amber has asked, the whiskey example has a really clear connection between product and nature, which is what you, Jenny, have mentioned in your last answer before we broke out to rooms. But where the connection is less tangible, what is the key lever you use to convince boards about bringing in nature to core strategy? Jenny or Tom?
I'll take that. I mean, it depends what you mean by less tangible, really. I mean, it's whether you mean less direct to the business or in the supply chain. I mean, there's a whole point of mapping out how relevant nature is to the business. You know, quite frankly, some businesses have very little closeness or relationship to it, and it doesn't make financial sense for them to do anything, and they won't. You know, it would be nice for every business to do something, but that's not the reality. What we see with many companies, particularly in the manufacturing space and particularly in the electronic space, this is a really good example of where it's perhaps not immediately tangible, because, you know, if you look at their operations, they're in the middle of a business park. They don't really use any natural resources, and their supply chains are 30 suppliers deep somewhere in China, and they've no idea where anything comes from. But they still have to recognize that within the products that they're making, there are high impact commodities in there. There is a reliance on water somewhere in the supply chain. There are commodities which are, you know, in the extraction and production of them are creating some serious damage to the environment. And where this exists, there is a supply chain risk to the business, whether it's reputational. There are reputational issues which some companies can't even imagine happening, but in some cases they have. There are supply availability risks. In some cases, you might be sourcing something where there aren't very many suppliers, and they're sitting in in a high water stress area. Here there's opportunities to engage with the supply chain. If it's not tangible to your direct operations, then the next thing that we see companies doing is supply chain engagement. But you can't just go to the supplier and say, hey, we saw you're in a high water risk area, do something about it. You need to go to them with some bit more tangible information. You need to work with them to collect some primary data to better understand the context of what they can do and what levers they can pull. Really nice example is probably a company called Fairphone, out of the Netherlands, who we work with, and that they don't have very much in the way of production, but their supply chains are hugely impactful, and they're very well known for their supply chain engagement. They help to fund their suppliers' science-based targets. They're helping to fund nature level interventions. You can go and see their nature report. I think they just published it last week that outlines how they approach it. That might be a good thing to look at.
Thank you, Tom, and that's great to hear, actually, because I know for a fact that a few people in the room work for example, data companies. So where there isn't a sort of a clear product or clear supply chain in terms of building a product, I think it's really useful for people to know when they work with more sort of service-based. I'll move on to a question from Emily. How can TNFD account for business dependencies on harmful subsidies? For example, fossil fuel subsidies, depletion of fisheries, deforestation, etc. Where do business start in mapping this to look at how they are enabling the 7 trillion of capital flows to harmful activities to nature and how this affects their business?
I started answering this for Emily, but I suppose one of the things we didn't talk about is that actually through doing a TNFD assessment, that brings into scope looking at either where you're investing, but also what capital you're sourcing and potentially, how that could be linked to harmful effects on nature and ecosystem services. So it does very much form part of the assessment process, and it's about looking at what your scope of influence there is and how you can change that. But the broader point I was making is that this has been a topic which hasn't really been tackled head on enough at the kind of the global level and at the kind of governmental level. And I was just kind of drawing on an example of Ruth Davis up in Manchester. So she's the government special envoy on nature. She sort of highlighted that that's going to have to be a key priority for Treasury in the coming years to look at that. And I think there are some leading countries who've done, I believe it's the Netherlands, who've done a really interesting study on that as well. So we're starting to see conversations happening, but not fast enough. So yeah, it's a huge issue.
Thank you. And we're getting towards the end of our time, but I'm going to ask one more question. I apologize if I didn't get to more of your questions, but I'll quickly ask one question from the chat, which I think people might find genuinely useful. Daria's asking, are there any particular tools or software you use to map nature risks and opportunities, in particular in supply chains? What are the qualifications and skills that are needed in a team to perform such assessments?
There's loads of publicly available tools. If you look at the SBTN, Science-Based Targets Network, has a big data toolkit you can use, but it's mostly geospatial data. So if you've got geospatial expertise in the team, you can use that. What most companies use as a starting point, really basic starting point, is the Encore materiality screening tool. It's by no means that accurate or quantified, but what it is, and I'm just going to put a link to it in the chat, it's a public resource you can use. You can put in the type of business activity you carry out, and it outlines what the probable impacts and dependencies are for your business, and that at least gives you a starting point. So you can say, okay, water matters for us, deforestation matters for us, but invasive species doesn't matter for us. So it gives you a very quick way to narrow down the kind of things you're going to focus on. And where you might want to use internal primary data to evaluate the scale of those impacts. So you can get started with little to no expertise. To be honest, if you start getting into geospatial analysis or looking at very, very specific ecosystem features like rivers that you might be dependent on for a manufacturing activity, you might want to speak to an ecologist.
Thank you, Tom. And as we're coming to an end, I think it's just worth mentioning that that Nature Positive are exactly the kind of people that help businesses and companies do exactly that. So please feel free to keep in touch with Jenny and Tom. What I will do is I will now post in chat 2 links to our LinkedIn pages, both Restore and Nature Positive. So please follow us to keep in touch with our updates. Please find our guests on LinkedIn if you'd like to stay in touch. And we will be in touch with the recording. We will be in touch with further events and webinar updates. So hopefully we will see you on our next one. At Restore, we're planning to alternate them. So some of them we will sort of offer for the business sector, and some of them we will offer for the more landowning sector, as we work directly with people on the ground. But please save the date on the 25th of June. We will be hosting an in-person event in London, where Jenny and Tom will be also leading a practical workshop. So if you'd like to find out more about what we've talked about today, 25th of June, I will send more information to you in April, but please save the date in your calendar. The morning, we will have a couple of panels on sort of business pathways to nature positivity and nature investment. Then we will have 2 practical workshops. And then after lunch, we will also have a site visit at our project just outside of London in Slough. So a very, very engaging and interactive day for you all. But otherwise, it was fantastic to have you all. Thank you so much for registering, for coming. Thank you so much to our guests, Jenny and Tom. Thank you so much to Gil for hosting. And yeah, we'll keep in touch and hopefully see you all again soon.